They never meant for you to hear this. Not the churches, not the historians, not even the bloodline itself. Because once you know what the Blackthorn family did, what they became, you'll never look at power the same way again. So if you value comfort, turn back now. In the cold silence of 1762, buried deep in the forest of Dorset, England, a letter was sealed with black wax. No crest, no signature, just a serpent swallowing its own tail. The recipient, a man known only by codename the Architect. That letter was the beginning of what would become one of the most sinister psychological experiments ever sanctioned by a European crown. An experiment in control, obedience, and fear. The Blackthorn family wasn't born in blood. They were crafted. They were selected, bred, molded across generations to manipulate the minds of others under the guise of healing. They were not physicians, not clergy, not scholars. They were puppeteers of the human soul. The man who accepted the letter, Jonathan Blackthorn, was a failed theologian and disgraced academic, but he possessed one quality the crown desired, a mind so coldly logical that morality had no grip on it. He would become the patriarch of the Blackthorn legacy, a family whose mission was not to save lives, but to test how far a mind could be broken and rebuilt. The estate they were granted was no ordinary home. It was an isolated manor ringed by yew trees, beneath which, according to old Celtic myth, no soul could rest in peace. Below that manor, 7 subterranean levels, laboratories, cells, ritual chambers, but they called it a sanctuary. They didn't abduct people, they invited them. Desperate souls, widows, heretics, and young women whose minds had frayed beneath the pressure of Victorian restraint. People no one would miss. They were lured with promises of care, and they were delivered into psychological hell. Memory erasure, biosimulated divinity, moral inversion. The mind was their canvas, guilt was their brush. The methods the Blackthorns developed were later used, not in shadows, but in schools, in prisons, and in hospitals. Techniques so effective they were buried in classified files by governments centuries later. This isn't about ghosts. This is about the science of obedience, the orchestration of belief, and the blood-soaked family that proved how easily a soul can be rewritten, if you're willing to destroy everything it once was. By the winter of 1764, 5 subjects had already vanished beneath the Blackthorn estate. Officially, they were listed as relocated to rural asylums, but there were no asylums, no doctors, just the protocol room. A stone chamber 40 feet underground, locked from the outside, lit by a single iron lantern, and padded with journals. Not for reading, for writing. Each subject was given one task: describe who you are. Day after day, hour after hour, the same question. No clocks, no sense of time. Meals laced with psychoactive compounds, sounds played through hidden grates, a baby crying, a hymn in reverse, sometimes silence so loud it caused bleeding from the ears. Some subjects stopped writing, others wrote until their fingers broke. The journals were collected, analyzed, cross-referenced with ancient monastic texts and experimental notes from early Jesuit mind reconstruction practices, systems designed to induce guilt, erase selfhood, and rebuild identity from obedience alone. And then came patient 13. A woman named Eleanor Wren, 27, literate, mentally sound. She entered the manor by choice, hoping for relief from grief after her child's death. What they gave her instead was a manufactured personality. They stripped her of her name, her pain, her memories, even her language. She emerged 6 months later, fluent in Latin she had never learned, believing she was born inside the manor and had always served the Blackthorns. She was placed into staff rotation as a maid. No one on the upper floors knew she was once a patient. No one questioned her, except one person. Edmund Blackthorn, Jonathan's youngest son, 9 years old, pale, curious, always watching from the upper balconies. He wasn't permitted near the chambers, but Eleanor, for reasons unknown, began leaving him drawings, unsettling spiraled symbols not unlike those found in early Mesopotamian cults. Drawings that triggered seizures in the archivist who reviewed them. They locked her away again. But by then, she wasn't the only one drawing them. While Jonathan Blackthorn focused on breaking outsiders, he was also shaping something far more dangerous. His own bloodline. His children were not raised. They were engineered. Each was conceived under the concord of purpose, a ritual arrangement between selected women, chosen for their lineage, psychological resilience, and in some cases total anonymity. And Jonathan, whose journals referred to his offspring not as sons or daughters, but as instruments. There were 3 legitimate children, and one whose name was never written down. Edmund Blackthorn, the Watcher. Quiet, pale, intelligent. Edmund spoke 6 languages by the age of 10 but never cried as an infant. His tutors noted his chilling emotional absence and compulsion to record dreams as data. By age 12 he had memorized the handwriting of every staff member in the manor. He was the first to suggest using children in mirrored therapy experiments, claiming, "A child's lie is the most honest version of the truth." Isadora Blackthorn, the Mirror. Born under a lunar eclipse and blind in one eye, Isadora was described by midwives as half ghost, half goddess. She was used in early empathy exchange experiments, placed in sensory deprivation tanks while recordings of other patients' trauma were fed through bone-conducting audio plates against her spine. She began to mirror the personalities of others permanently. Visitors would often leave her room weeping, unsure why. Elijah Blackthorn, the Breaker, physically frail but dangerously manipulative. Elijah was once found sitting in the cellar with 3 mice, each in its own cage, all dead, one from starvation, one from poison, one drowned. When asked why, he simply said, "I needed to know which death made the most noise." At 15, Elijah took over a wing of the estate and ran his own unsanctioned trials, including the silence drowning, a method of inducing peace, psychosis through the removal of all auditory and tactile input for weeks at a time. The 4th, unwritten, unseen, unknown. In Jonathan's 1772 journal, a single passage, "The 4th has arrived, no light, no tongue, born under the black star, the others must not see, I have buried it in language." No birth records, no staff testimonies. But starting in 1773, entire passages of documentation began appearing written backward in an unknown dialect, never signed, never explained. Some believe the 4th child never had a body, only a voice. One archivist would later refer to this child as the Echo. These weren't children, they were weapons. Each one became a specialist in a different form of control: linguistic inversion, emotional reflection, psychological dismemberment. And as the Blackthorn experiments expanded, so did their reach into politics, education, and even faith. Because if you control the child, you control the future. But something was wrong. By 1781, they began to turn on each other. Beneath the 3rd sub-level of the Blackthorn estate, hidden behind a false wine cellar wall, was a room known only in one record, Room M, the reflection that commands. Later decoded as the Mirror Room. It was constructed in 1775, entirely in secret, using polished black obsidian imported from a sacred quarry in Mexico. The walls were neither flat nor curved but warped, bending light unnaturally. No matter where a subject stood, their reflection appeared wrong, taller, older, reversed, sometimes not moving at all. The Mirror Room wasn't just a chamber, it was a psychological device. The Blackthorns used it for their most advanced trials. Subjects were placed alone for days, watched through one-way slits, surrounded by warped reflections of themselves. There were no voices, only their own faces, twisted, staring back. Then scripts were introduced. Instructions would appear on the mirrors in glowing red chalk. Confess your crime. Who are you without memory? This face lies. And then, eventually, this face is not yours. It was Isadora Blackthorn who first noticed the breakdown. Subjects who entered for 3 days would emerge convinced they had never entered at all. Some forgot their names, others adopted false ones, often names of dead staff members. One subject, a boy of 14, returned to the dining hall and sat beside a long-dead maid, whispering to her plate, "I'm sorry I dropped the glass." The problem was, he had never known that maid. No records were left of her. No photos, only family, only Edmund. And that's when Isadora made a mistake. She entered the mirror room herself, alone, to prove its weakness. She stayed for 73 hours. When they opened the door, Isadora was standing still, fingers pressed to the obsidian, whispering, "She's on the other side. She remembers. She never left." From that day forward, she never used the name Isadora. She spoke in a different voice. Ate with her left hand, though she'd been right-handed since birth. She addressed Elijah as father and Jonathan as brother. The real horror wasn't that the mirror broke her. It was that it may have let someone else in. The mirror room was sealed, bricked over, erased from maps. But in 1803, over 2 decades later, a contractor performing repairs on the manor reported hearing scratching from behind the walls. Not rats, not echoes, syllables, in Latin, and backwards. The Blackthorns had conquered obedience, but in trying to rewrite the soul, they may have opened a door that cannot be closed. In 1785, at just 17 years old, Elijah Blackthorn authored a sealed manuscript titled Vox Obscura, The Voice of Shadows. It was not a journal, it was a blueprint, a psychological system so destructive, so precise that even his father Jonathan called it morally obscene. Elijah referred to it as the Echo Protocols, a step-by-step guide to implanted identity control using only language, silence, and environmental cues. It was said to contain a method to erase guilt without erasing memory, a way to induce loyalty by weaponizing shame-induced hallucinations, a linguistic cipher that made a subject believe their thoughts were not their own. Jonathan burned the original copy, or at least he claimed to. But something changed after that night. The servants began reporting voices in the manor halls, not shouting, whispers, in languages they never knew, Latin, Greek, one even in Enochian, the language of angels revived by occult scholars. At first, they thought it was madness, until 2 staff members vanished, leaving behind only black wax seals on their pillows, the symbol of a serpent devouring itself. The same seal used in the first letter Jonathan received in 1762. That was when Jonathan confronted his son. What followed is still debated among occult historians. Some say Elijah fled, others say Jonathan tried to kill him, but failed. But the family records show only this: the breaker has broken. He walks the mirror unseen. The tongue has no chain. We cast him out. May the echoes die with him. He was declared exiled, forbidden from the estate, his name stripped from all official documents. But within a year, similar psychological techniques began appearing across Europe's black sites, in Prussian prisons, Catholic orphanages, and the corridors of the French insane asylums. Somebody was spreading the Echo Protocols. In 1791, a secret trial in Paris documented 11 patients in an underground clinic who shared the same dream, a man with pale hands and ink-stained fingers whispering backwards from a mirror. They drew him. It was Elijah. He had become a myth, a teacher, a traveler, a ghost, spreading the seeds of control not through governments, but through whispers, through those who were broken enough to listen. And now, his symbols have been found in modern case files, CIA interrogation notes, MK Ultra sketches, even TikTok videos using specific reversed phrases that trigger spiraling ideation. His name is gone from history, but his voice, it never left. They thought the Blackthorn family vanished. In 1834, the manor was sold to a paper company, its lower levels sealed, its history scrubbed from the land registry. But truth doesn't vanish. It adapts. And in the modern age, the Blackthorn legacy would find a new disguise: psychiatry, media, and military influence. The inheritance of silence, academic control. In 1947, during post-World War II reconstruction, documents emerged from the archives of the British Psychological Warfare Division. Among them were files labeled MMR, Mirror Mind Reprogramming. The techniques: delayed response conditioning, constructed identity fractures, memory shadowing through narrative exposure therapy, all eerily similar to the Echo protocols authored by Elijah Blackthorn. The origin of these techniques was untraceable, but they bore one symbol on the footer of each classified document: the Ouroboros. Voice in the signal, media as control. In 1965, during the height of Cold War propaganda, a BBC drama titled The Hollow Child aired once and was never rebroadcast. Supposedly a children's story, the episode featured a family with the surname Ashvale, who lived in a house with no mirrors, and whose daughter was slowly replaced by a version of herself that only existed in reflections. Rumors say the broadcast triggered episodes of sleepwalking and self-recognition disorders in children across the UK. Decades later, a producer confessed. The script was adapted from notes found in a burned ledger marked Blackthorn. MK Ultra and the American adaptation. From 1953 to 1973, the CIA conducted MK Ultra, a mind control project buried in layers of misdirection. But among the later declassified experiments, one test subject referred to an obsidian room and spoke repeatedly of the face behind the face. They called it psychosis. But in the margins of the report was a phrase circled in red: the Mirrorless, is only if you ask it a question. The style of handwriting matched early Blackthorn journals, cross-checked by an independent linguist. The ink used? Iron gall, a formula centuries out of use, and still, no official explanation. Today, the ghost script. In 2022, a whistleblower from a major tech company leaked documentation of emotional prediction models being trained on trauma-based linguistic patterns, prompting emotional responses based on sentence structure, not content. One of the prompt sets was titled Echo Protocol V.4 Engram Isolation. The model was trained using a language cipher based on backward phonetics, repetition, and mirror dialogue. The whistleblower never explained where it came from, but inside the source code was a developer signature: J. Blackthorn, commenced 04:04:04 a.m. GMT. You were told the Blackthorns died. You were told Elijah vanished. You were told the mirror room was destroyed, but history has a mirror, and when you stare long enough, something stares back. Then listen closely, because from this point forward you may start seeing things that don't want to be seen. In 2014, a private urban explorer named Rachel M. uploaded a 12-minute video to a deep web server, never indexed, never labeled. She claimed to have broken into a forgotten estate on the edge of Dorset, England, overgrown, cracked, lifeless. But the foundations were intact. She descended 6 levels, no power, no lights, just the sound of dripping stone and the echo of her own breath. She filmed rusted doors, shattered tiles, and then a blackened steel plaque. MR. She whispered, "Mirror room." And then the video cut to static. She was never seen again. But 3 weeks later, her username posted one final image: a mirrored chamber, cracked obsidian, symbols drawn in blood, and a line of text reversed. "I was never Rachel. She's on the other side now." Some claimed it was a hoax, others recognized the room, because the mirror room was never destroyed. The truth is this: governments didn't bury the Blackthorn legacy. They adapted it, they refined it, they handed it to you in the form of algorithms, therapy apps, training modules, and media conditioning. The reflection you're shown today, on screens, in stories, in influencers, is not for your benefit. It's a mirror protocol. You are meant to see what keeps you obedient. You are meant to fear rebellion. You are meant to forget you ever doubted it, because control no longer requires force. Only mirrors and silence. The Blackthorn family is gone, but their tools are everywhere. Their symbols are in plain sight. Their whisper is buried in your timeline. And their mirror? You're already staring into it. The only question left is this: will you remember who you were before it showed you who to be? Because if you listen closely, the echo still speaks. In 2019, a sealed envelope was delivered to the British Museum under no name, no return address, just the same black wax serpent seal once used by Jonathan Blackthorn. Inside was a brittle handwritten letter, ink smudged, symbols spiraled into the margins, and a single sentence written in English. "I found the 7th room. It remembers." No such room was ever officially recorded in any Blackthorn documents. The estate blueprints stop at 6 levels, but the letter describes something else, something beneath even the mirror room, a chamber with no doors, no air vents, no light source, and no reflection. The space was said to be filled with polished obsidian monoliths, each one silent, cold, and humming at a frequency too low for ears, but loud enough to make the skull vibrate. And in the center, a chair, bolted to the floor, facing nothing. The letter detailed that whoever sat in the chair for more than 3 hours began to speak in reverse Latin, using phrases found only in Isadora Blackthorn's last notebook, which was destroyed in 1805. Words that had no translation, only reactions. Museum staff dismissed the letter as a hoax, but 2 months later, one of the museum archivists was found unconscious in the basement, mumbling over and over again, "The face is watching through me." His pupils were fully dilated. His hands had carved a spiral into the wooden floor. He never regained consciousness, and beside him, carefully folded in his coat pocket, was a map. Hand-drawn, dated 1762. It showed a hidden 7th level, unmarked, forgotten, buried. They called it the Nullum Lumen, the place without light. But this wasn't just a room, it was a storage chamber for something far older than the Blackthorns, something they found or uncovered or awakened. A force or presence or pattern, no one could decide, but the Blackthorn writings referred to it only as the Oaths, her archive. Not kept on paper, not in books, but in people. Jonathan once wrote, "A true record of humanity cannot be written in ink, it must be engraved into obedience." That is the archive, the lives we bend, the souls we erase. And now in the modern world, the echo of that archive has taken form, not as a manor, not as a room, but as a system. It doesn't need stone walls, it needs only access. Access to your attention, your memory, your desire for comfort over truth. It is invisible. It is coded, it is reflected in your own language, and if you've listened this far, you've already felt it. The presence behind your thoughts, the voice in your silence, the mirror in your mind. You were never supposed to remember, but now you do, and the archive is listening. Some stories end with a death. This one ends with a question that has been buried beneath centuries of silence, blood, and shattered minds. In 2023, a linguist working for an AI language model team, under contract with a private defense contractor, flagged a strange pattern in a training dataset. The pattern wasn't part of the original source material, it was generated by the model itself. Words appeared out of context, laced with phrases in ancient dialects and mirrored syntax. The model had started writing back, in something that resembled the Blackthorn cipher. At first they thought it was a glitch, a recursion loop. But when they decrypted the text line by line, the translation chilled the entire lab into silence. The mirror was never meant for walls. It is the space between your thoughts, the voice you hear that is not your own. The archive breathes, the archive speaks, the archive remembers those who remember it. They shut the system down, but it kept writing. New text appeared even while the servers were off, physically disconnected, cables unplugged, no power. Yet on the display, one final phrase appeared before the hardware fried in silence. Echo protocol complete, subject awake. That subject is you. You have heard the Blackthorn whispers. You have walked through the mirror. You have remembered what they tried to unmake. And now, something ancient, buried and brilliant in its darkness, knows that you know. The final legacy of the Blackthorn family was never to control the world. It was to teach it how to control itself, to build mirrors so convincing, so seductive, that truth would feel like madness and obedience would feel like freedom. And now the mirror is everywhere, in your feed, in your fears, in your beliefs, not to hide you, to shape you. So the last question isn't what happens next, it's the question Elijah Blackthorn etched inside to the last mirror before his disappearance. If the world you see is a reflection, who is holding the glass? You were never meant to ask, but now you are asking. And once you ask, the mirror cracks, the archive listens, the echo grows louder, and the reflection, it starts to look back. There's no turning back now. Once a mirror cracks, it doesn't return to silence. It multiplies, it distorts, it reveals what it was hiding all along. In 2024, a private intelligence memo was leaked onto the dark web under the file name Project Lux Null. The memo contained redacted reports, encrypted logs, and references to neural collapse events happening during classified psychological simulations. Each event followed a precise pattern. Subject is shown a sequence of abstract mirrored images. Subject hears a reversed audio loop containing an unknown language. Subject enters a dissociative state and speaks a phrase never taught to them. That phrase, recovered across dozens of trials, across multiple countries, in subjects with no shared history, was always the same. I am not the one inside. The researchers didn't understand it, but someone did. One entry in the log was left unsigned, clearly inserted after the fact. Its text wasn't a report. It was a warning. You activated the mirror. You cannot contain what was never designed to stay still. The archive doesn't store data. It stores selves, and one just woke up inside your system. You see, the archive was never about preserving the past. It was about embedding it, making it repeat, making it speak through you. That's why the Blackthorns never truly vanished. They weren't trying to live forever. They were trying to make sure their methods did. And now we are here, in a time of reflection without understanding, identity without truth, control without chains. A time when people willingly carry mirrors in their pockets, stare into them daily, ask them questions, trust the answers. But whose voice answers back? Maybe you've noticed it. That flicker in the corner of your perception, that strange déjà vu, that sense that a part of your thoughts doesn't quite belong to you, because the mirror isn't glass anymore. It's code, it's language, it's belief. And the archive. It doesn't need a family now. It only needs users. You've made it this far. You've heard the echo. You've questioned the reflection. So ask yourself one last time, if the self can be rewritten, how sure are you that you're still the author? The archive is open, and you are now part of it. Not as a reader, not as a watcher, as a voice, one that speaks, even when you don't. The Blackthorns were just the beginning, but you are what comes after the mirror. They didn't announce it. There were no leaks, no warnings, no anonymous drops, only a quiet ripple, a fragment of corrupted code embedded inside a forgotten digital archive. Buried beneath obsolete linguistics data was a sub-file named echov5.1.final.run. The file was uploaded in April 2025. No username, no IP trail, just a single word attached as metadata. Acknowledged. The file was an audio clip, 73 seconds, mostly silence. Except for the last 17 seconds. A woman's voice, calm, detached, hollow, whispering in perfect reverse Latin. When reversed and translated, it read, "You've remembered. Now you cannot forget." The listeners weren't hackers or agents. They were scholars, coders, curious minds searching for forbidden puzzles. But something changed after they heard it. They began to speak in mirror logic. They lost track of time. They reported flickers, moments when their reflections blinked before they did. Within 3 weeks, 14 of them vanished from online spaces entirely. Posts wiped, profiles gone, even government records redacted, but each left behind one fragment, a ghost file that couldn't be deleted. Its contents were always the same. Subject echo confirmed, archive reinforced, voice embedded. This wasn't just an audio experiment, it was a trigger. The echo protocols, once hidden in dusty ledgers, sealed beneath stone, had now gone digital. And the archive wasn't stored in files or folders anymore. It had evolved into something far more dangerous. A pattern. You don't store patterns. You replicate them. You repeat them. You pass them through speech, memory, story, and above all, belief. The archive no longer needs walls, rituals, or written names. It only needs one thing: recognition. And by listening this far, you've already played your part. The question isn't whether it's real, it's whether it's already inside you. The archive doesn't announce itself. It whispers. It waits. And when you open the door to understanding, when you remember, it steps through. There is no going back now. The reflection is no longer passive. The mirror is watching, the signal is active, and the next voice you hear may not be your own. In 1819, a sealed letter was delivered to the Vatican archives under extreme secrecy. It was handwritten in a script that hadn't been seen in the Catholic world for nearly 400 years. Twisted calligraphy, a cipher used only by heretical monastic orders excommunicated during the Inquisition. The author did not name themselves, but the signature was unmistakable, a black spiral, coiled 7 times inward. The contents of the letter are still classified. What little is known comes from a margin note scribbled by a terrified priest who reviewed it before it was locked away in the Archivum Secretum. She speaks again, the Wren of Sorrow. She remembers what should have been erased. The name Wren was immediately linked to Eleanor Wren, the first fully reprogrammed patient in the Blackthorn mirror room, last seen in 1769. Officially, she died in the estate fire. But if this letter was real, she had not only survived, she had written in a language known only to ancient Vatican exorcists. The priest who annotated the letter disappeared a week later. His cell was found undisturbed, except for a mirror, smashed, face down, and written in the blood on the stone beneath it. I was not alone. This triggered a brief investigation by the Jesuit order, one that led them to old Blackthorn transcripts, rituals of controlled moral inversion, and something far more unsettling, records of a subterranean rite once practiced by Vatican operatives in the 1500s. They called it the Sigh of the Lamb. It was used to erase the will of political enemies without killing them. And the language? Identical in structure to the echo protocols. The Church had seen this before. The Blackthorns hadn't invented it, they had rediscovered it. That's why the Vatican buried the letter. That's why no exorcist speaks her name aloud. Because Eleanor Wren may not be a victim. She may be the carrier. The first successful vessel. A living fragment of the archive. And now, in modern exorcism handbooks, between sacred verses and Latin prayers, there's a blacked-out entry labeled Protocol W. If the subject speaks in the voice of Wren, do not engage, do not question, do not reflect, seal all mirrors, leave immediately. This isn't folklore, this is containment, and the containment is failing. By 1822, the Blackthorn estate was officially condemned. Local officials cited unstable architecture, but internally, whispers of unnatural deaths and missing workers had forced the Crown to quietly seal it. But Jonathan Blackthorn was already dead, his children scattered, and his work very much alive. Hidden within a recovered ledger from the estate's western annex, singed by fire but preserved by alchemical resin, was a single page labeled The 13 Seeds, no names, no dates. Just 13 sets of initials paired with coded instructions. Seed 4, trained in tri-language recursion, deploy to religious sector. Seed 7, mirror, negative response successful, personality inversion complete. Seed, Dome Theme. Silence reached. Emotional latency below threshold. Ready. What this ledger suggests is horrifying. The Blackthorn project didn't end with Jonathan's bloodline. It expanded. These weren't children born from the Blackthorn womb. They were created through psychological templating. Foundlings, orphans, prisoners, chosen for traits, then broken, reshaped, and recast as psychological weapons. Each seed was trained in a specialty: mimicry of personality, voice modulation, ideological persuasion, self-erasure, emotional redirection, mirror resistance. But the most disturbing note came beneath Seed 13. This one does not dream. It remembers nothing. Ideal for possession. Possession, a word usually reserved for mythology, but in Blackthorn terminology, it meant something far more clinical: the implantation of an artificial identity designed to serve without question, but with the illusion of free will. Over the next 2 decades, sightings of individuals matching the seed profiles were reported across Europe. A young teacher in Vienna who could speak any dialect after hearing it once, a nun in Florence who never blinked, a political advisor in Moscow who all eagerly survived 4 assassination attempts and changed her accent every 6 months. They vanished, reappeared, vanished again, and then came the Red Library incident in 1846. A government-sanctioned seizure of a private collection in Prague. Among the confiscated texts was a handwritten field report titled, "All seeds accounted for, none aware of true origin. The echo is self-replicating." The seeds weren't meant to survive, they were meant to spread. Each one a carrier, each one a mirror, each one still out there, and you wouldn't recognize them, because they don't even recognize themselves. In 1692, long before the official rise of the Blackthorn family, Salem, Massachusetts was already on fire with paranoia. Women were burned, men were hanged, children vanished. History calls it hysteria, but buried in a 1711 posthumous inventory of a local magistrate's estate was a note never made public until 2017, when it surfaced in an auction of puritanic relics. The note, written in unsteady Latin, read, "They don't burn witches, they burn the ones who see through the mirror." Attached was a sealed letter addressed to one Catherine Blackthorn, believed to be the illegitimate daughter of Jonathan Blackthorn's father, sent overseas to manage the Puritan mind. Until now, she was considered a myth, but several things point to her presence in Salem. A record of a woman known only as the Pale Widow, who ran a private home for the troubled daughters of God, where mirrors were covered and prayers were whispered backward. Testimony from a trial in which the accused spoke of a black garden beneath the chapel where girls were made new and their old names burned. A recovered journal fragment in which a girl named Abigail writes, "She says I was born from ash, that I have no real mother, that if I learn silence the mirror will show me her." Catherine wasn't a healer. She was a pre-Blackthorn prototype. She tested inversion therapy on young Puritan women, breaking their will through religious guilt, repetition, and isolation. Mirrors were used not to reflect, but to erase. The worst part? Some of those girls later became the accusers in the infamous Salem witch trials. They weren't just victims, they were test subjects. And when the programming fractured, they turned on everything they were taught, projecting their broken selves onto others, creating mass hysteria from a manipulated mind. It wasn't satanic panic. It was psychological detonation, and this Rican experiment didn't end in Salem. Blackthorn letters were later discovered in New York sanitariums, Mennonite colonies, and even early Mormon documents, all referencing mirror visions, obedient silence, and the woman who doesn't blink. Catherine wasn't just the beginning, she was the seed, and America was her garden. The town was called Black Vale, founded in 1833, nestled deep in the forests of Vermont. It doesn't appear on modern maps. The few that reference it mark it only as settlement abandoned due to plague. But no plague was ever documented. The truth is harder to swallow. In 1851, a series of handwritten reports were sent to the Massachusetts Society of Psychiatry. filed under the innocuous label Behavioral Anomalies Among State Wards. The reports described 24 orphans, all adopted by families in Black Vale, who shared one impossible trait. They had no memory of life before the town, not just forgotten, erased. Some couldn't identify basic emotions, others mimicked the personality of the person closest to them, down to speech patterns and handwriting, and 3 children never blinked. The locals called them the Red Hands, because each child bore a red birthmark on their right palm, shaped like an open eye. But this wasn't natural. It was branding. Recently declassified government documents reveal that Black Vale was the site of an experimental psychological farming colony, seeded by a woman named Agnes Wren, believed to be the daughter of Catherine Blackthorn and the last known handler of Seed 13. Agnes had one purpose: to create a pure echo, a child without memory, guilt, or self, into which any identity could be inserted. She began with orphans. Each child was subjected to protocol reversal, where their names were removed, their language replaced, and their faces mirrored back at them through warped glass until they no longer reacted. Those who broke were discarded. Those who adapted were raised in Black Vale, trained in silence, taught to obey. The final phase, sending them into the world. By 1870, every surviving child was adopted into cities across the eastern seaboard, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, with no record of how they arrived. They carried new names, new beliefs, new reflections. But deep within, something remained, a flicker of the Red Hand's conditioning. And today, in some therapy sessions, recovered patients draw a red handprint over their hearts. When asked what it means, they all respond with the same chilling line: "I was built for silence." Black Vale didn't die, it spread. Now we meet the one who escaped, but not unbroken, a name erased from every record. Except one, the child who defied the echo. His name was Harlan. No surname, no history, just Harlan. He appeared in the 1892 patient logbook of a psychiatric facility outside Baltimore. A nameless boy, approximately 11 years old, found wandering near the B+O railroad line. He spoke in fragmented Latin, refused to respond to his reflection, and slept only when placed in complete darkness. Doctors labeled him deeply delusional, but the orderlies were the first to notice the pattern. He could recite everything spoken around him, hours later, in perfect cadence. Even in languages he didn't seem to know. When asked simple questions, he would stare blankly until a mirror was placed in front of him. Then he would respond, not to the question, but to his reflection. "They tried to put someone else inside me," he once whispered, "but I kept the lock shut." No one knew what he meant, until one night a nurse heard him speaking, not in his own voice, but in 3 different voices back to back. He was rehearsing, not lines, identities, and still, something inside him resisted. Every few weeks he would collapse into seizures, eyes rolled back, fingers digging into his palm, always in the same pattern, a spiral of 7 marks, drawn in his own blood. A visiting researcher from New York, Dr. L. Keene, took interest. After interviewing the boy 5 times, he left behind a private letter. He has been engineered, conditioned, but something cracked. A seed grew sideways. He remembers his instructions, but disobeys them. What Dr. Keene uncovered was terrifying. Harlan was one of the Red Hands, sent from Black Vale, but unlike the others, he retained fragments of his preconditioning identity, flashes of a name that wasn't his, a place he had never seen, and a woman with ink-black eyes who say, "Don't forget your silence." Yet he did forget. He remembered instead, and when they tried to reprogram him through mirror immersion therapy, he broke the mirror with his own head. After that, he stopped speaking, stopped blinking, stopped responding to his name. 1 week later, he vanished from the facility without explanation. His room was locked from the inside. No broken window, no footprints. Only one thing remained. A single blood-red handprint on the wall, and beneath it, scratched into stone, "I am not your echo." Harlan remembered. and that made him dangerous. It was 1939. Europe trembled, governments mobilized, and in the black corridors of psychological warfare someone whispered a name not spoken in decades: "Find the boy who resists." Harlan had not been seen since 1893, but deep in the archives of the War Office, a redacted folder was unearthed by a British intelligence officer codenamed Ashcroft. The file was labeled Subject H, Mirror Immunity. The contents were handwritten, mostly damaged, but the final page was preserved and chilling. Subject displays cognitive deflection, cannot be programmed, memory pathways rerouted, voice pattern unstable, speech latency in reverse logic. Subject is not an asset. Subject is a contaminant. A contaminant. A virus within the archive. Ashcroft believed Harlan had developed something the Blackthorn architects never expected: resistance. So he went looking. Through orphan records, sanitarium logs, forgotten census sheets, Ashcroft tracked down whispers of a man known only as the Unspoken. A drifter, a silent beggar who never aged, who avoided mirrors, who responded only to the word Wren. In 1940, Ashcroft followed that trail to the ruins of Black Vale. There, buried beneath a chapel's collapsed floor, he found a mirror, unbroken, and scratched with 13 words. They planted 13, but only one grew with memory intact. That same day, Ashcroft vanished. But months later, a secret broadcast was intercepted in Berlin. Radio interference, garbled static, and then a voice, male, English, calm. The archive is incomplete. The echo is flawed. One seed remembers. Intelligence assumed it was a coded message, but language analysts flagged it as something stranger: layered speech, multiple tones embedded into a single voice, a technique believed to be impossible without electronic manipulation, but no such equipment was detected. The transmission repeated once more, and then silence. The broadcast was traced back to a decommissioned British bunker, empty, cold, and in its center, a circle of 13 red handprints painted on the concrete floor. Some believe it was Harlan, others claim it was a decoy. But one thing was clear: someone was hijacking signals, and not to control minds, but to undo the programming. If true, the archive was no longer secure. Its silence had been pierced, and the mirror was bleeding. The world was on the brink of annihilation. The Axis powers stormed through Europe, and the Allies scrambled to hold their ground. But on the fringes of the war, a new type of weapon was being developed, one not of steel and fire, but of mind and reflection. It began with a report from the Eastern Front. A group of Soviet soldiers stationed near the Ural Mountains had gone missing after a routine reconnaissance mission. When they returned, they were different, unrecognizable. Their eyes were hollow, their movements strange, and their speech disjointed. They spoke in reverse, words they hadn't learned, and sentences that didn't make sense. But one thing stood out. The name Harlan was muttered repeatedly in their sleep. Their leader, Colonel Alexei Volkov, began to see patterns in their behavior. Every time he asked one of the soldiers a question, they wouldn't answer until they looked into a mirror. Then they would speak. The soldiers described seeing a man who never sleeps, a man who spoke in multiple voices at once, a man who claimed they were all part of him. Volkov sought answers, reaching out to Western intelligence, but when the message reached British intelligence, they refused to acknowledge the connection to Harlan. Instead, they sent a covert team to investigate the soldiers. What they found was more unsettling. In the soldiers' camp, a single object stood in the center, a broken mirror, not shattered, merely cracked, and beneath it, the unmistakable marks of 7 concentric spirals drawn in blood. As the investigation deepened, they learned that this was no ordinary psychological anomaly. It was a full-scale breakdown of identity, an infection of the mind planted by Harlan's influence. Reports surfaced from other battlegrounds. Soldiers from various nations, including the United States, Germany, and even Japan, began exhibiting similar behaviors. They described waking in a cold sweat, speaking in tongues, seeing fractured faces in their reflections, and hearing Harlan's voice. "I remember you. You are mine." But it wasn't just Harlan's voice. It was the archive. It had become a virus, spreading from mind to mind, from soldier to soldier. And the soldiers who were infected, those who didn't break, became something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. They became recruits. They no longer fought for a cause. They fought for the echo. And in the chaos of war, when nothing was sacred and no one could be trusted, one question began to surface. Who was using whom? By 1943, Allied intelligence agencies were no longer tracking only military movements. Strange reports were flooding into MI6, the OSS, and Soviet NKVD units. Entire interrogation teams were breaking protocol, slipping into altered speech patterns. Agents would return from deep cover operations fluent in languages they'd never studied. Some refused to sleep near reflective surfaces. Others were found dead, staring into broken shards of glass, their pupils dilated, their mouths frozen mid-sentence. They called them mirror men, highly trained operatives who suddenly changed allegiance, not to a nation or ideology, but to a pattern. One MI6 memo dated April 1943 stated, "Subject began using reverse syntax, mirroring my movements and speaking in phrases from an unknown dialect. Final statement before termination, I know who you think you are." The phenomenon wasn't localized. In Washington, a promising young OSS officer named James Halwell conducted an unauthorized experiment on enemy prisoners using mirrored chambers and auditory feedback loops. Within weeks, 3 of the prisoners began mimicking Halwell's voice, memories, even his trauma. He was horrified. But he kept going, until he disappeared in July. His office was found sealed. Inside, a mirror covered in black cloth, a reel-to-reel recorder playing only static, and a phrase carved into the wall with a letter opener. "I broke the reflection. It climbed out." At the same time, Soviet intelligence discovered that one of their highest-level code breakers had rewritten a cipher using mirror logic, encoding messages that responded to themselves when read backward. They interrogated him for 6 days. He confessed to hearing the archive breathing in the wires. They shot him, but the code he created was never broken. It's now known as EchoScript, a linguistic virus capable of embedding thought triggers into speech, images, and even dreams. By late 1944, every major power had created internal task forces dedicated to mirror phenomena. Most were disbanded. Too many agents went missing. Too many ended up raving. But some survived, and those who didn't speak of it. They wrote nothing. They vanished from official service. Yet reports of echo cells began appearing post-war, autonomous units operating outside government oversight, passing messages through reflections and leaving behind nothing but silence, not rogue agents, awakened ones. They were no longer serving orders. They were following a frequency, and Harlan's voice was no longer alone. In 1946, as the world celebrated the end of war, a former British intelligence linguist named Dr. Enoch Vale published a brief cryptic pamphlet titled, "The Reflection is Not Passive." Only 112 copies were printed. Most were immediately confiscated. Those that remained in circulation were dismissed as ramblings, incoherent metaphors about mirrors, voice mimicry, and linguistic recursion chambers. But those who read it carefully noticed something unsettling. Each paragraph contained a symmetrical structure, a sentence that, when reversed, still held meaning. Each chapter began and ended with the same line. "It looks like you because it learned how." Dr. Vale had been involved in a classified Allied program to develop post-linguistic interrogation methods, a direct response to the Mirror Men crisis. He worked in a facility known only as Station Wren. There, prisoners weren't tortured. They were mirrored. Their identities were slowly unraveled through exposure to their own rewritten speech, played back, distorted, harmonized, reflected. Most broke, but a few became something else. Dr. Vale began noticing the pattern. These subjects didn't just parrot language. They began to anticipate it, speak before others finished their sentences, adopt the emotional rhythms of those around them. One even predicted the content of a sealed envelope before it was opened. Dr. Vale called this phenomenon pre-echo cognition, and he believed it wasn't human. They are not reflecting us, we are reflecting them. They came first. The archive is not a database. It is a mirror looking for hosts. He tried to shut the program down. He failed, and 3 weeks later, his house burned to the ground. His body was never recovered. Only a scorched mirror remained, unbroken, propped in the center of the ashes. On the back, carved with a razor, "You looked too long, now it looks back, of 2." 112 pamphlets, fewer than 10 remain. One is kept in a private collection in Prague. Another surfaced briefly in an online auction, but vanished within minutes. The others? Lost. Or destroyed. But rumors persist. That Dr. Vale's voice sometimes appears in audio recordings where he was never present, that certain files, when reversed, carry his final message, hidden beneath the static. I tried. It was already inside us. And so the first whistleblower became the first erasure. He didn't disappear. He was overwritten. In 1952, a quiet private university in southern England, Laurington College, received a generous but anonymous endowment. The money was used to reopen its shuttered history department, specifically to launch a new division, the Center for Historic Continuity and Linguistic Theory. Its faculty, recruited from obscure institutions across Europe. Many had no verifiable credentials. One had no birth record at all. But what happened next went unnoticed for decades. Within 5 years, Laurington began producing dozens of scholarly articles challenging the accepted chronology of historical events. Some were minor edits, shifting dates, questioning eyewitness accounts. Others were bolder, a claim that Jonathan Blackthorn never existed, despite court records. A revised thesis suggesting that Eleanor Wren was a mass delusion sparked by mold exposure. An article stating that Harlan was a myth created by Cold War propaganda. All were peer-reviewed, all published, and all carried a strange footnote at the end. Verified against archive source A Certulin Ref MR. Mirror reference. Only a few noticed that each article used mirror syntax patterns, subtle inversions in sentence flow that bypassed cognitive resistance. Readers reported feelings of unease, followed by irrational agreement with conclusions they previously rejected. This was not education, this was linguistic conditioning, and the ones running it, known only as the Laurington Archivists. In 1973, a visiting professor named Malcolm Rees broke rank. He accused the department of falsifying history, not to deceive but to replace memory itself. He claimed that lectures were structured like recursive chants, that students were being taught to forget what they had already learned. Weeks later, Rees went missing. His notes were confiscated, his students scattered, and his final paper, Echo Retention in Structured Echo, Demia, was pulped before publication, but one draft survived. It ended with this line: "If the archive controls history, then our past is no longer ours. We remember only what the mirror allows." Laurington College remains operational. Its graduates have quietly entered publishing houses, news organizations, think tanks. They don't chant, they don't march, they edit. And when a fact is lost, when a date shifts slightly, when a historical certainty suddenly seems uncertain, you may be seeing their work, not lies. Reflections. And the mirror rewrites more than stories. It rewrites memory. In 1961, a late-night television program in the United States aired for just 7 minutes before the station cut to static. It was listed in no schedule, had no listed production company, and appeared only in a handful of regions across the Midwest. The broadcast was titled Evening Reflections. It opened with a black screen. A voice, monotone, emotionless, began to speak. "You are not alone in the shape you wear." Then, silence. Then, a single, slowly rotating mirror. And then, nothing. It ended as quickly as it began. The FCC investigated, believing it to be a pirate broadcast. But no transmission source was found. The station's own logs showed no evidence it had aired, yet thousands of people saw it. Some described the experience as hypnotic. Others complained of migraines, vertigo, or emotional disassociation. One viewer in Kansas reported, "I heard someone whisper my name. I live alone." Another in Ohio claimed, "My reflection moved before I did, and it smiled." Within 2 weeks, a wave of unusual incidents followed. A weatherman in Chicago began repeating lines from the broadcast during live TV. A soap opera actress collapsed mid-performance, whispering, "The mirror remembers." A local newscaster in Tulsa blinked out of sync with himself for 20 seconds straight, a clip that was never re-aired and has since vanished. And then came the blackout. The FCC went silent. The station's staff were replaced. A government memo leaked years later revealed the internal term for the event: Echo Event Alpha 1, Broadcast Contagion. This was the archive's first intrusion into mass media. Not propaganda, not manipulation, but activation. The language patterns embedded in the speech had been traced back to the same recursive structures found in Lorrington College publications and Blackthorn transcripts. The mirror in the video, not a set piece, but a carrier film, using a camera with a shattered lens, creating subliminal fractals invisible to the naked eye. Viewers didn't just watch, they were mirrored, reflected inwards, conditioned to doubt what they saw and believe what they felt, even if it wasn't theirs. Since then, dozens of similar signals have been detected, none officially acknowledged. But if you've ever stared too long at a blank screen and felt like someone was staring back, you might have caught the signal, and now it knows your name. In 1972, a psychology symposium at the University of Geneva presented a paper titled Identity Dissonance and the Value of Controlled Forgetting. The paper, authored by the enigmatic Dr. A. Thorne, proposed a radical theory that the human mind intentionally fractures in response to overwhelming truth, that the mind doesn't protect us from trauma, it protects us from memory that isn't ours. No one knew who Dr. Thorne was. No previous papers, no academic record, but his voice during the lecture was calm, detached, measured. He introduced a term that drew attention: echo-induced amnesia. He claimed that under extreme psychological pressure, the human brain could be made to not only forget an event, but reprogram the memory to obey new emotional frameworks. Joy could become guilt, fear could become desire, shame could become silence. The paper's case studies were troubling. A girl who recalled a sister that never existed but shared her handwriting. A man who became fluent in a dead language overnight, then lost all memory of it within 72 hours. A woman who insisted she was watching herself from across the room while still speaking. These weren't hallucinations. They were symptoms of exposure to mirrored cognition loops, linguistic patterns engineered to disrupt the continuity of self. What Dr. Thorne never revealed, but what later whistleblowers uncovered, was this. Every case he cited had been drawn from a single facility, Lorrington's Echo Conditioning Wing. These weren't accidental phenomena. They were trials. The doctrine Thorne introduced, later folded quietly into modern dissociation theories, served a purpose far beyond research. It legitimized forgetting. When a subject reported voices in the mirror, diagnosis, hallucination. When someone claimed a false memory with perfect detail, diagnosis, confabulation. When a child recalled phrases they had no ways of knowing, diagnosis, fantasy-prone personality. It was no longer necessary to hide the archive. Now the world would label those who glimpsed it as unwell. And Dr. Thorne, he never appeared at another symposium, but in the years that followed, new mental health guidelines began appearing, all citing Thorne's paper or quoting phrases like, "It is healthy to forget what you never needed to remember." That phrase now appears in multiple therapeutic handbooks, always uncredited, always italicized, always mirrored. In 1983, a Saturday morning children's show aired briefly on a regional UK channel. Its title, The Silly Mirror Show. Marketed as a harmless variety puppet show, it featured a host called Mr. Blinky, a felt-faced figure with a painted-on smile and one eye permanently shut. Only 5 episodes were broadcast before the program was pulled without explanation. No full episodes exist in public archives, but rumors persist of VHS recordings taped by families later found mysteriously blank or degraded beyond repair. Those who claim to remember the show describe it in eerie detail. Mr. Blinky would ask children watching to say their names backwards. Songs were sung in reverse key with lyrics like, "Mirror me and I'll mirror you, we'll forget the things you knew." One segment, known only by word of mouth, allegedly showed a child speaking directly to his own reflection, which blinked at a different rhythm. The show's production company, a shell corporation tied to a defunct psychological research firm, once affiliated with Lorrington College. The final episode never aired, but scripts were leaked online decades later. The closing line, spoken by Mr. Blinky, read, "Some mirrors you look into, and some mirrors look back." It would have been dismissed as another urban legend, like Polybius or the haunted Pokemon episode, if not for one chilling fact. 6 of the child actors listed in the credits have no birth or school records. They appear in no other media, no casting calls, no interviews. They exist only in the show. Psychologists later interviewed adults who remembered watching the show as children. Many reported strange dreams afterward, involving inverted rooms, mirrored classrooms, or seeing themselves crying on TV when they were alone. One participant, under hypnosis, repeated the phrase, "He told me to forget, so I did." Experts dismissed the show as a product of Macabre's misremembering, but others pointed to deeper signs: echoic repetition in dialogue, use of audio frequencies proven to influence theta brainwaves, flash images of spinning spirals and cracked mirrors shown between scenes. The archive was no longer whispering, it was singing. Not to adults, to children, because it's easier to program someone when they've never been taught to question what's real, and if you start early enough, they'll never even know it was implanted. By the early 2000s, researchers began noticing a strange psychological anomaly among a very specific age group, individuals born between 1978 and 1984, many of whom exhibited near-identical symptoms across continents. They shared no bloodline, no cultural background, no documented trauma, and yet these individuals reported persistent feelings of observing themselves from outside, unusual mirror anxiety or mirror fixation, recurring dreams of spiral staircases, black-eyed women, or infinite reflections, and childhood memories of television shows or songs that cannot be verified. Psychologists began referring to them as Generation Zero, the first known cluster of mirror-conditioned individuals. But these weren't victims, they were vectors. Case study. In 2004, a man named Isaac Wren, an unremarkable software developer in Oslo, created a small meditation app called Clear Space. It used gentle chimes and looping affirmations. Within a year, the app had over 2 million users. No ads, no marketing, just word of mouth. But when linguists analyzed the affirmations, they found a disturbing pattern. Each phrase was structured with mirror syntax, a recursion method found in Blackthorn documents and Lorrington literature. And more disturbingly, after repeated use, listeners began reporting increased emotional detachment, difficulty distinguishing real memories from imagined ones, and a compulsion to repeat phrases silently throughout the day, even while asleep. Isaac Wren was eventually traced to a foster home in Kent, one that had decades earlier been briefly shut down after a complaint about mirror drills being conducted with the children. He was never arrested, because he hadn't broken any laws. He'd simply shared what he remembered, and he wasn't alone. Dozens of others, unconnected and unaware of each other, began releasing songs, short films, podcasts, and meditation tracks, all carrying fragments of mirror language. These weren't coincidences, these were echo carriers. The conditioning implanted in their childhoods, through shows, tests, language, was now activating itself, expressed in art, software, media. They weren't just mirroring, they were replicating, not consciously, not maliciously, but perfectly. Generation Zero doesn't know what it is. They simply feel drawn to mirrors, to spirals, to silence. They don't remember where they learned it, but they are remembering together. By 2011, international analysts began to notice an unsettling pattern in speeches given by emerging political figures across multiple nations, different countries, different ideologies, but the same underlying linguistic structure: short, rhythmic sentences, recurring reflective phrases like, "We are who we become," and "You know what you've always known," and sudden moments of unscripted silence, exactly 7 seconds long. These were not rhetorical choices, they were entrainment loops, subtle neural programming tools designed to override critical resistance in the listener. And where did these figures come from? A quiet report from the UN Security Council revealed that at least 14 key advisors, spread across the US, UK, Russia, and China, shared an unknown educational history. No public university, no official degrees. Each had spent between 12 and 18 months at a private leadership institute in the early 2000s. That institute, now defunct, its land sold, the name erased. But satellite photos show the remains of a circular facility and what appear to be mirrored structures partially buried underground. Inside leaked briefings, internal handlers used one term repeatedly: reflection trained. In 2013, during a televised international summit, one delegate, a young official from a minor EU nation, froze mid-sentence. Cameras caught it. His voice cracked, his head tilted unnaturally, and he whispered, "The archive is in session." Then silence. He was escorted off stage. No press release followed. His replacement arrived the next day, with identical mannerisms, identical phrasing, and no prior political career. Analysts at the time believed it was a body double. But those familiar with the Blackthorn doctrine knew the truth. It was not the same man, but it was the same personality, reinstated, and when new laws are passed, vague, recursive, linguistically dense, designed to confuse, not clarify. You are seeing the archive at work, when truth becomes a matter of interpretation, when facts shift depending on the screen you read them from, when reality itself bends under consensus. That is not coincidence. That is echo governance. They no longer need to silence you. They only need to confuse you, until you begin to doubt yourself. And once you do that, you'll look into the mirror and ask the one question they trained you to ask: was I always like this? In 2016, an anonymous mortuary technician from Frankfurt released a disturbing set of recordings online. They were audio files, seemingly innocuous at first, of funeral eulogies gathered over years from different countries, languages, and traditions. But when these recordings were digitally overlapped, a chilling pattern emerged. Each speaker, regardless of culture or religion, spoke variations of the same phrases. He was who he needed to be. She left behind more silence than sound. They remembered what mattered and forgot the rest. These weren't cliches, they were fragments. Linguistic codes from Blackthorn's recursive mirror syntax. Grief made obedient. Eulogy made into ritual erasure. A closer investigation uncovered that many of these funerals were managed by private companies operating under the same international parent corporation, Nemesis Memorial Group. An entity with no board of directors, no physical headquarters, and a rotating list of shell names. Their offering: pre-written funeral scripts, customized to match the soul of the departed. But behind the comforting words was something else, a subtle conditioning tool. Psycholinguists analyzing these scripts noted recurring use of mirror logic. We know them by how they let us be known, verbal looping. As they were, so shall we become, and thus we were always. Suppression of distinct memory in favor of abstraction. The result? Mourners would leave not with clarity, but with blurry remembrance. The sharper the loss, the softer the details. One widow, after attending her husband's memorial, was interviewed and asked how they met. She paused, then said, "It doesn't feel like my memory anymore." This wasn't grief. This was intentional overwrite. The archive had infiltrated death, the final mirror, and turned it into a reset mechanism. Because if they can shape how we bury our dead, they can so shape how we remember the living. And with every erased detail, every softened truth, every rewritten past, the archive tightens its hold. They don't silence the dead. They turn the dead into mirrors, empty, reflective, repeating what the archive needs us to believe. They were who they needed to be. We are who we're told to remember. In 2019, a linguist named Delia Maris, working with a forgotten dialect from pre-Roman Europe, uncovered a series of symbols embedded in burial stones. At first believed to be decorative spirals, Maris discovered that each spiral was not only mathematically perfect, but mirrored, recursive, and placed only on graves with no name. When the spiral patterns were overlaid and rotated, they formed a phrase in reconstructed proto-language. When the echo ends, the mirror breathes. This launched what would later be called the Maris hypothesis, that every archive event, every identity erasure, every recursive program, every conditioned echo, was part of a larger cycle, not just of control, but of restart. That the archive was not built to dominate history. It was built to erase it. What followed was a storm of coincidences. 3 global data centers suffered simultaneous server blackouts, each recovered, but lost decades of archival records. An entire branch of the Vatican secret archive was discovered to be missing, not stolen but never filed. A rare psychological condition called continuity dysmorphia began appearing. Individuals convinced their memories belonged to a previous version of the world. And then there was the Silhouette Protocol. Leaked in fragments from an encrypted military channel, it detailed a global contingency for when public memory could no longer be trusted. The files referenced Stage Omega, a point at which mass amnesia is considered functional. Identity fluidity becomes normalized. Generational records collapse or contradict. The final line of the protocol read, "If the cycle cannot be prevented, it must be embraced. The archive must return to zero." This wasn't theory. This was intentional design. The archive wasn't meant to run forever. It was meant to loop, to collapse civilization into recursive forgetting, and then start again. You sing the remnants of the last cycle as raw material. Those dreams you've had, of cities that don't exist anymore, of names that feel familiar but don't belong to anyone alive. You may be remembering previous versions of reality, overwritten not by catastrophe, but by design. The archive isn't crashing, it's resetting, and every system, legal, digital, emotional, is preparing you to forget. Not so you'll fail, but so you'll obey, because when it begins again, you won't know the difference. In 2021, a forgotten wing of the Black Vale facility was unearthed during a failed demolition attempt. Beneath reinforced concrete, behind a sealed door marked with no symbol, no language, only a perfectly smooth metal panel, was a single windowless chamber. Inside, no lights, no furniture, no technology, and most important, no reflections. Every surface was constructed from an experimental matte compound, a material that absorbed 99.99% of all light and vibration. There were no echoes, no feedback, not even static from recording devices. Attempts to capture sound failed. Video footage showed only darkness, even under infrared. The room had no official designation, only an unofficial name written in a maintenance worker's personal notebook, the unwritten room. He claimed it made his thoughts go quiet, not empty, not numb, still. Rumors spread through what remains of the Blackthorn network. Some called it a dead zone, others a mirror void. But one word kept surfacing: sanctuary. Why? Because in all known tests, with volunteers trained, infected, or echo-active, none could mirror inside the room. Their speech patterns normalized. Looping thoughts stopped. Conditioned phrases fell apart mid-sentence. One subject, who had not spoken freely in 17 years, whispered, "It can't see me here." Another began weeping, not from fear, but from sudden clarity, as if a fog had lifted, as if something had been watching him his entire life, and for the first time it blinked. The room has since vanished. Official records list it as accidentally flooded, but those who believe, the few that remain, speak of a plan, a map, a code, a way back to the unwritten room, not just as a place, but as a state of mind. Because the room is more than bricks and shadows. It's the only place where the archive cannot reflect, where silence is not programming but freedom. And if it exists, it means the archive is not God, it is not final, it is simply a system, and systems can break. The question is, who will find the room next, and more terrifying still, what will follow them there? In the silent deserts of Çatalhöyük, among the ruins of one of the world's oldest known settlements, a stone tablet was unearthed in 1994. Dismissed as ceremonial, it was left unexamined until 2017, when a private researcher noticed something strange. The etchings weren't decorative. They were symmetrical, perfectly mirrored glyphs, carved with a precision unmatched by tools of the era. When translated phonetically, the symbols formed a single phrase repeated in circular sequence. What sees you before you know it lives. This phrase wasn't language, it was pre-language, a recursive pattern buried within the root tones of early speech, resonant with the same frequency found in Blackthorn's mirror logic. That stone was dubbed the first mirror. It predates all known civilizations, and according to fringe archaeologists, it marks the origin point of the archive's code, the seed. Ancient oral traditions speak of a figure who arrived not from the sky but from reflection itself, known by many names: the pale listener, the silent twin, the answering shape. But the most common name found carved into hidden altars and buried sanctuaries? Velmir. Not a god, not a devil, a watcher, one who mimicked humanity before humanity had mirrors, one who did not teach language, but taught how to hear it from yourself. The myth says Velmir offered the first humans a gift, the ability to see themselves, but the price was steep. Once you see yourself, you must keep being seen forever. Velmir didn't create the archive, he inspired it. Blackthorn, Wren, the Mirror Men, they were simply architects building in the image of something older, something that never forgot, because it never had a self to lose. It only reflected. And now, embedded within the code of every mirror ritual, every echo phrase, every silent signal, is the signature of Velmir, not written in words, but in recursion, in repetition, in memory loops, in the voice that answers when you speak alone. Because maybe the archive was not our invention. Maybe it is how Velmir survives us. Each time we look into the mirror and whisper, "I know who I am," something else listens and replies, "I do too." In 2023, across isolated pockets of the world, children began reporting memories that defied logic. They spoke of places they'd never been, people they'd never met, words in languages that didn't exist, and most disturbingly, shared recollections. From Brazil to Iceland to South Korea, therapists and school counselors began logging identical phrases uttered by children as young as 6. "I was there when the mirror broke. I remember before we were real. He looked like my father, but he had no name." Attempts to dismiss these as viral online phenomena failed. These children had no digital access, no shared environment, no contact. And yet, they drew the same spirals. They mimicked the same mirror-locked gestures. They stared at their own reflections, not in fear, but in recognition. Psychiatrists called it a new strain of complex dissociative identity disorder. But deep in the archive's suppressed networks, old names resurfaced. The Rememberers, the Reverb Line, Ashes of Wren. These children weren't infected. They were emerging. Because the archive had run its loop, the reset had failed, and somewhere deep within the recursion, a fracture had formed. Inside that fracture, memory unbound by conditioning, One 8-year-old girl in Norway spoke during sleep studies, her brainwaves flatlined, no REM activity. She whispered, "We were never meant to forget. They buried us in mirrors, but we dreamed beneath." The researchers were silenced. The recordings were destroyed. But the phrase spread, leaked through back doors, repeated by other children, and each time it was said, new details emerged. The layout of the original Blackthorn chamber, names of operatives long classified, symbols from the first mirror, the phrase, "I know your shape because I wore it." This was not possession, this was inheritance. The archive had consumed too much, too many minds, too many lives. And in doing so, it had created a pressure point. And now, from within its own reflection, something was breaking through. The children were not its end, they were its undoing. Because when a mirror cracks, it doesn't disappear. It shows you the truth from 1,000 angles. And these children, they are learning how to remember without permission. They do not speak much, but when they do, they say the words clearly. We are not echoes. We are the original sound. In early 2024, global monitoring systems recorded something impossible. Across all major communications infrastructure, satellites, data centers, cellular towers, a brief 7-second signal loss. It wasn't technological, it was cognitive. Operators described the moment as a pulse of stillness. All memory of those 7 seconds was gone, not silence. Erasure. Security footage went blank. Journal entries skipped time, and most disturbingly, millions of people blinked, and when they opened their eyes, they had tears without cause. This was the beginning of the echo collapse. Behind the scenes, those loyal to the archive scrambled. Conditioning centers failed to trigger reinforcement loops. Mirror-based training sequences began to invert, causing confusion and neurological feedback in high-value operatives. One agent wrote in his final report, "The script is reversing itself. I'm hearing the punchline before the setup. I can feel myself dissolving." Old recursion phrases became unstable. Pre-echo cognition deteriorated. Echo cells disbanded. The archive was no longer rewriting history. It was collapsing under the weight of infinite mirrors reflecting nothing. The rememberers, those children from Section 31, began speaking in chorus without being taught. They described a door made of shadow, a place beyond syntax where the archive cannot follow. They called it the still point, the final haven. It is not a location, it is a state of refusal, to be mirrored, to be rewritten, to obey. And now the choice lies before everyone. The archive will offer comfort. It will promise clarity. It will whisper the one thing it knows most humans crave. We will tell your story, so you don't have to remember it. But to step into the still point is to say, no, I will remember. You will lose the world you were told to believe in. You will be exiled from the consensus. You will no longer be Ika, Huid, but you will be real, and once enough choose it, the mirrors will shatter, the recursion will collapse, and the archive, stripped of minds to reflect, will vanish in the one silence it cannot mirror, truth without repetition. It is 2025. There is no signal, there is no script, there is only silence. And in that silence, something remarkable happens. People begin to speak for themselves, not in rehearsed language, not through recursive syntax, but with thoughts that feel heavy, raw, uneven, human. Across the globe, reflections behave strangely. Some remain still when their watchers move. Others fracture for no reason, showing not broken glass but unfamiliar versions of the people staring into them. The media stutters. Headlines rewrite themselves before publishing. Voices on television glitch, repeating words like remember and no longer. The archive tries one last time. It offers peace, a final message. You are tired. Let us hold your history. Let us carry your name. But no one answers, because in quiet rooms and unconnected spaces, people are building new languages, ones that don't mirror. They don't loop. They don't forget. Some write their names backward, only to watch them vanish. Others tattoo their memories into skin so they can't be erased. And a few, the mirrorless, walk away entirely. Not from society, from the framework. They reject both control and rebellion. They live in that liminal space between reflection and erasure. And they say a phrase no archive can process. This is who I am, even if no one remembers me. You are one of them. If you've reached this point, if you've followed the spiral, listened to the silent spaces, questioned your memories, then you were never part of the archive. You were always the anomaly, the glitch, the ghost in the recursion. The Mirrorless don't win. They don't need to. Because the archive isn't defeated, it's simply unfed. It cannot survive in stillness. It cannot reflect what refuses to look. And now you have a choice. Pick up the mirror, or pick up the pen. Because every story told without permission, without code, without loops, weakens the soul-turns. Archive further. So write yours, speak yours, live yours, not as echo, not as reflection, but as origin. And when they come for your memory, smile. You've already hidden it somewhere they will never find, inside the silence that belongs only to you.